Welcome, my name's Dan and I'm going to be sharing with you a video presentation which is basically trying to outline an ethical response to the question, should Pentecostals reframe their response to homosexuals? So because this is ethically shaped, we're going to look at two predominant systems in when it comes to Pentecostals, their response to homosexuality, and that is divine command theory, which is basically using scripture to basically orientate our beliefs around, and the other one is the natural law theory, and that is that of this world that we live in basically shows us and tells us a bit about God, and we're going to look into that. I'm really excited. Hopefully out of this I'm going to try and give an unbiased presentation where the listeners can decide for themselves what aspect they sit on. This is a really important debate inside the church, and unfortunately it doesn't take place inside the church very often. It's often outside the church, leaders, pastors, theologians, authors having discussions around this, and they can often be heated. I'm going to show you in a little bit just some videos of some debates that show us how heated these can become, and also they can become quite stuck in the mud. But before we go too far, I just want to share you a little bit about myself. Like I said, my name's Dan Leeworthy. I grew up in Australia here, so when I talk about the Pentecostal church, I'm talking about that I have understood through my Australian past. And in the past, growing up, I have leant more to the fundamental traditionalist perspective on this matter. But since studying, doing theology, I am trying to, and I think I am moving more towards that middle ground. So hopefully I can share from that perspective today and allow you across from this lens to make your decision on where you stand on these matters, and even more importantly, at least understand the other side, which is really important in this debate. So before we start, let me talk to you about the traditional Pentecostal perspective here in Australia. And this is shaped predominantly through the AOG church, which is now the ACC church. They brought out a formal response to homosexuality back in 1979, and since then they've looked over it a few times, but the main emphasis has remained, and that basically is to condemn homosexuality as a sin based on the plain reading of scripture. So I'm going to read a little response here just to get you some perspective of the traditional Pentecostal belief. It should be noted that at the outset, there is absolutely no affirmation of homosexual behavior found anywhere in the scripture. Rather, the consistent sexual ideal is chastity for those outside a monogamous heterosexual relationship and fidelity for those inside such a marriage. There is also abundant evidence that homosexuality, along with illicit heterosexual behavior, is immoral and comes under the judgment of God. So that's a little snippet there, and you can see that what's really important to Pentecostals traditionally is the plain reading of the Bible. What does Scripture say? And that's where we're going to spend a large part of today looking at. And also, it's important to know that the perspective is that the sexual ideals inside the Pentecostal church is that of, and also predominantly a majority of other churches, is that of chastity and also a monogamous heterosexual relationship, marriage. So like I said, this debate has been mainly happened outside the church, so we're basically trying to bring that back into the church here, and it's really important because everyone's thought long and hard about this question, and it's important to get the right information and stop that headbutting that often can take place. Let's now look at some videos of some debates and probably what not to do.
And just say, what do people think Paul meant here? And you will find almost nobody in the room who says, well, to be honest, lifelong faithful same-sex relationships were fine for Paul. That isn't reality, I'm afraid. Yeah. But then there's a story.
I disagree with that very strongly indeed. And I think that any tour of few Wikipedia pages.
Well, but I don't do my theology on Wikipedia.
No. There's some very mature Wikipedia. Anyone can look at that point for themselves. They can. The preacher's telling me one thing. I'm looking at my smartphone. I'm checking out. Is he true?
Let's hear your reaction to the story. Will back up any point. But that is not. But I think obviously for Steve, it's very important that it makes it look like, well, there's loads of views. Nobody knows. Hang on, nobody knows what the right one is. I'm just simply telling. I'm making a bit of an appeal here to somebody to go and say, go and buy the 10 leading commentaries on 1 Corinthians, or the 20, or the 50. Go and buy the BDAG, which is the standard New Testament lexicon that everybody would use, or any of the others, and go and talk to. Just take a straw poll and you'll find that is a tiny minority view, and you understand why. Well, we do have a disagreement. But
welcome back, and as you can see, this is a very heated debate, and people often will be left. The moderator will often struggle because people will be left with this. I understand what you're saying, but I disagree. This is my belief, and then they hit this roadblock where the moderator has to push through somehow. So we're trying to avoid that today. And after we go through each ethical system, we're going to do a bit of a summary, just so everyone can follow along. So the pro-homosexual theologians will argue that the Bible never condemns the relationship of a loving and monogamous same-sex couple. Now, to the traditionalist, this is absurd for them, quite frankly, and this is what brings about, I think, a lot of that really harsh response, because they believe because of the videos, information that they've received, they're shocked because how could these people misread what is otherwise clearly stated in the Bible? We're going to look at some of those things, but proponents, in short, claim that such Bible verses that suggest homosexuality is evil is actually characterized by the perverse nature of homosexuality during that time, which often looked like orgies, rape, just an overflow of sexual desires. They may not have been homosexual in nature, possibly. There was a perverse nature that characterized homosexuality during that time. There was a lot of pedophilia and things of that nature. So let's look at some text now. Again, we're looking at now divine command theory, that is scripture, and how that affects our moral compass and our ethics. So there's basically 7 Bible verses that have been used traditionally to condemn homosexuality. One of which is Noah and Ham. Theologians believe it alludes to some sexual activity that took place, and if it was sexual in nature, it would constitute rape. And what pro-homosexual theologians will say here, that it may not be the homosexuality that God and Noah has an issue with. It is that rape that took place. What didn't happen between a loving, consensual relationship did not happen within those boundaries. Another one is Sodom and Gomorrah. We're going to go through them quick, but I just want to share these so that the listeners, that particularly those who come from a traditional background, can understand that actually you do need to think about these Bibles verses more carefully and look into them, because again, the pro-homosexual theologian will say they're doing better biblical scholarship when they look at the context, and on the other hand, the traditionalists will say the exact same thing. How can you? This is what it says. How can you misrepresent what the Bible is saying? So again, we'll keep going through these. Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19 is an attempted gang rape. Also, a people group that did not look after and protect those in need, the sojourner, and that, which is another serious offense in the Old Testament when there was not much welfare systems. So as you can see here, there's no Christian that would promote such activities as gang rape. And again, pro-homosexual theologians say this is why it was condemned so harshly. Another big one is in the Leviticus law code. There's a number of Bible verses there, 2 particularly, that condemn homosexuality. And this is possibly an allusion, because Leviticus is written towards the priest from God and obviously Moses about how they should conduct themselves. And Robert Noon suggests that they're actually directed towards the cult prostitution of the day. And what God was wanting from the people of Israel is that they would not engage in this perverse spiritual experience that was common in those days. The priesthood would not look like this. We're supposed to, be different from those type of people. So that may be, News believes that is why this is condemned with the death penalty. It's also important to know, whether or not you read that into the text, that there's other things that are condemned with the death penalty in Leviticus that we would not necessarily believe even to be wrong today. I'll give you an example. Having sex with a woman while she's on a menstrual period is condemned by death in Leviticus Holy Code. So as you can see, we shouldn't be so hard-lined on these Bible verses. At least Chris Myers believes that. So Charles Myers. Let's look at now the New Testament. And the New Testament has got a little bit to say about homosexuality. It's interesting. Homosexual theologians will say that Jesus actually never mentioned, and it's true, Jesus never mentioned homosexuality. He was silent on that case. But Apostle Paul mentions it a few times. When he's talking about his vice list in 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy, it mentions homosexuality as a sin, and News again believes this is connected to the male prostitution and pederasty that characterize the pedophilian nature of the relationship in Greek and Roman culture towards men and boys. And no Christian of any denomination would suggest a thing like male prostitution and pedophilia being okay practice. It's also important to know, and this is what Charles Myers highlights again, is that homosexuality is mentioned alongside other common practices amongst the Christian community, like greedy, slanderers, and drunkards. And it goes on to say in that Bible verse that none of these people will inherit the kingdom. And Charles Myers says that we have too readily plucked out homosexuality as a bigger evil, a more evil, despite it sitting alongside, like I said, common practices, which no one would say were good, but that we sort of brush aside, such things as slandering or greed. So it's another aspect to that mention of homosexuality in the Bible, which isn't quite, maybe we have gone too harshly on in our community, judging people and saying that you can't be both a homosexual and a Christian. Lastly, another Bible verse is in Romans chapter 1. Pro-homosexual theologians will suggest this is directed at the sexually perverse homosexuality that look like cult orgies, directed at the ISIS cult of the day and that worship that was common in amongst the Romans. As you can see, these Bible verses that mentions homosexuality, there's a lot going on behind them. There's a lot of situations that no Christian would condone, like rape, sexual orgies, pedophilia, just an abundance of sexuality that's promiscuous in nature, and things along those lines. And of course, Christians would condemn them harshly. So that for those pro-homosexual theologians, they'll really highlight this, and it's an important thing to highlight that those things we will condemn. We do condemn. We're not just getting rid of those Bible verses. We're taking them in their proper context and what they're directed at, which may have been a cult practice, which may have been, a situation where someone was getting raped or whatever, and we too come down harshly upon those actions. But what they will say is the homosexuality that was characteristic of that biblical time was hardly those of two consensual, loving, monogamous relationships of same sex. That's the pro-homosexual theologian's point of view. On the other side, the traditionalists will say that you can't read anything other than, the Bible saying that one male and another male having sexual relationship is wrong, because at the plain reading of the text, it seems to suggest that. So they're like really strong on that sort of line. It's also another thing they might mention is that the people who wrote the Bible, the Jewish, Paul, Peter, etc., the authors would have thought homosexuality to be wrong because that was the Jewish custom. And again, there's another response to this. News says, we do not theologize off of their cultural assumptions. We theologize off the texts we have in the canon. So this debate goes on. One thing we should mention, and in summarizing this debate here, that the once simple condemnation of all homosexual activity under the divine command theory is undergoing a significant challenge, and when looked in depth, it is a shaky foundation to build such a condemning ideology against a particular people group. And this is due to the situation and circumstances that surrounded, obviously, the mentions of homosexuality in the Bible. Moreover, the Bible does speak about showing grace, love, and acceptance to people of all different backgrounds, which Christian homosexuals will really advocate for. Despite this being the case, there is no doubt that the Bible actively promotes chastity and heterosexual monogamous relationships, that of a marriage between a man and a woman, as ideal. The Bible constantly suggests this is the ideal situation for those people who are in sexual, for all people really. So let's keep that in the back of our mind as we now shift to another hotly debated aspect inside this debate of homosexuality and how the church would respond to this particular issue. So the other one is natural law ethics. So some Christians will explain this as general revelation. Like I said earlier, creation, what we discover about God inside creation through natural means. It's used throughout the Bible by God to judge both the Israelites and also the surrounding neighbors. So it's a really important ethical system. As of recent, in the past, like I said in Romans chapter 1, Paul suggests homosexuality as unnatural. You can see Paul arguing from this natural ethics system. And that was largely historically the understanding of homosexuality until more recent times, where there's been lots of study in genetics, biology, the environment we live in, etc. And it's starting to highlight mixed influences that take place on someone who openly comes out as homosexual, who has homosexual tendencies. The response, and you can see this change, basically similar to a heterosexual relationship, like in a marriage, you have thoughts, maybe desires towards, any woman that might attract you, and these thoughts might enter your head. Similarly with homosexuality, it will move the goalposts away from having those desires to acting upon them. So amongst a majority of Christians, they'll say it's okay to probably have those thoughts come into your mind, but you shouldn't act upon them, because we're starting to realize that due to a lot of these influences, like we said earlier, genetics, biology, environment you live in, you might not necessarily choose, and the science seems to suggest that you largely don't choose at all your natural inclinations when it comes to sexual orientation. So one particular response to this from the more traditional point of view will suggest that this took place during the fall, that there was a breakdown, and this is again highlighting the world that we live in this imperfect world that one day God will perfect, which is, you can understand that point of view, highlighting those ideals inside Christianity. And even amongst homosexuals, they often, when they're sharing about it, they'll share about how difficult it is, etc. The complications that they have, the confusion sometimes that took place. So that's what the more traditionalists will say. So it's still not something you should engage in. They keep using this word sin, which is a common word, but it's also really has a lot of condemnation attached to it. So although this is the case, it still doesn't resolve all other factors like the psychological impact, social, cultural, hormonal even. All these things affect a person and their sexual orientation. Quickly to summarize what we're just talking about here, it seems inside nature that it is still ideal in studies suggest in your personal health, also ideal from a societal perspective in terms of childbearing, family environment that comes from there. So in a natural sense, it's still ideal to have heterosexual relationships. But it's also it's important to know and important to say that we need not judge homosexuals on their orientation or assume that that's a choice that they necessarily chose to be homosexual. So therefore, if a Christian is to judge homosexuality as a sin, and I mean acting upon homosexual tendencies, one should do so with incredible grace and care. That's the main emphasis that what we learn through natural law ethics. Okay, there's a whole bunch of other ethical systems that we could look at, such thing as utility. That means utilitarian ethics is basically about the outcome, the best outcome for the most amount of people, so for society, for that person in general, etc. There's also moral relativism that is largely around today. That means it may be right for this person but wrong for another, and you often hear when this debate takes place, and I'm going to share in a moment 2 stories of 2 different homosexuals, the church's influence on them and how they reacted. And this shows you that, it's a really fine line. So moral relativism is another ethical system, not necessarily one that's traditionally engaged with from a Pentecostal perspective. There's also cultural ethics, emotivism, which is a really, it's a wicked thing in my opinion. Emotivism is that of, when you think about homosexuals, you go, your response isn't, oh, that may be not the best, or whatever. Your response is, yuck, that's emotivism, which is, again, homophobic in nature and something that will come out in these types of debates. So we want to be careful not to respond from that point of view, because in general, that ethical system is not a good one. So let me tell you 2 stories here, and that might help highlight the particular things we've been talking about. I heard these during a debate, and you had one obviously pro-homosexual theologian and one more traditional theologian on their respects to homosexuality. And one of them told this story about a homosexual he knew that basically discovered that he had these desires. When told his pastor's response was to basically, call this demonic evil, to try and exorcise this person from that demonic influence, etc. So this homosexual young male who was going through a lot of difficult things, obviously got told that this is evil, this is a demonic influence on your life. And over the next 5 years, this person had regular, he had a deep faith. He wanted to stay faithful to his beliefs, and he regularly went in for exorcism type experiences. And this person actually developed a really low self-esteem. This person, because of this experience, had anxiety that took place, and really started struggling with themselves. They ended up turning to alcohol as a coping mechanism, and therein got alcohol addictions, and ended up really depressed in many ways. It's a really sad story about what can happen if us as Christians don't respond in a loving way, and how our beliefs on a particular aspect, or a particular doctrine can really impact people's lives. It's really important to know this is an important subject that we're talking about here. So that's what a typical story, although that is a real situation, it's a typical story of what a church's response to a homosexual. And a pro-homosexual theologian was sharing this to really highlight the importance of treating homosexuals with love and respect, and what could go wrong. On the other hand, a more traditionalist shared a story about a homosexual that came to another church who he knew and worked with, who also shared that they had homosexual tendencies. Now, this person was also prayed through, supported, and basically this person ended up, after some time, dealing with those things. Although he still has homosexual desires, he ended up getting married. He has kids now. He shares about overcoming those homosexual tendencies. And this person, this person would argue, telling the story, this person is living now a more fruitful life because he's able to have kids from his own seed, etc. His life's turned around, and he's helping a lot of people through that. So this is a story of 2 different homosexuals, 2 different churches' responses, and I just wanted to share them to center this around people, because this is what it is around. Okay, so where to from here? I hope this presentation basically has given you both sides of the debate, and helping you, at least if anything, realize the other side a little bit more. Hopefully by telling those stories of those people, you can center this around, like I said, people, the importance of protecting every single person that comes into a church. I want to now suggest an outcome that would still hold this traditional ideal inside Christian, and that we read through the scriptures. That is chastity for those who are single, and also if you're not single, to be in a heterosexual monogamous relationship, a marriage. But at the same time, also accept homosexuals in the church community as a viable option, and not judge them, to stop this dualistic nature of, sin and wickedness. Because those scriptures, like I said, that speak of it, there's a lot behind them. There's a lot of evil behind them. It doesn't represent that of a loving same-sex couple. So there's got to be a middle ground, is what I suggest. And I reckon we can do this by still speaking carefully about heterosexual marriage as an ideal and chastity, and refrain from using words like sin when talking about homosexuality. Instead, we can, still mention that it may not be ideal to be homosexual, but we do so in a loving way. Similar to how we promote lifelong marriage, but also carefully choose our words, not to condemn those people who are divorced. This is my step that I feel that the church really would benefit moving towards. And to do this, we have to get away this yuck feeling that some people have about homosexuality. We need to talk about it. We need to be more open about it. And we need to accept homosexuality as an option for Christians who have those orientations. That's my belief, but ultimately, you have to decide for yourself. This is a really important topic, and I hope I've given you some information that can help forge a really ethically sound doctrine that you can base your life on and that you can treat people with respect. So thank you for listening.